welcome.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I have to confess, he and I have done this a couple of times before, so forgive us if it gets a little indulgent. But when I wrote a piece about Libra, I've written a number of pieces actually for CoinDesk about Libra when it came out. I remember chatting to you just beforehand, and there's a line in there that you didn't necessarily take issue with, but it's to say that my view is I would love it if Libra were to survive and thrive, but I really want Facebook to die. And the point I was trying to make is not just that I really have a big problem with Facebook as a company for a bunch of reasons, and everybody knows the stuff I've written about digital media and its future. We're going to have Amy James come out a little later on, and she'll tell you the same sort of story. Facebook's done enormous harm, I think, to the way that we move information around the world. And yet Libra, at least in principle, right, is this concept that is supposed to be independent of all of that. That it could indeed be that Libra would survive and Facebook would die. It is not supposed to be directed by Mark Zuckerberg. And yet, the narrative, the constant conversation around Libra is that it is a Facebook product and that you cannot escape the genesis, the roots, where it came from. That will forever be a problem for all of the concerns that people have about data sharing and everything else. So counter that.
How do you answer that? Well, first, if you think about what this project represents, it's really designed at a governance level and at a sort of technology level to be resilient. And that would imply that it could survive the failure of any one organization, the departure of organizations, and effectively enable something that till now has remained a very noble but lofty and incredibly elusive goal of the digital finance and the cryptocurrency domain, which is how do you drive mass adoption? How do you remove insidious levels of friction that effectively make it a cost prohibitive to give people basic access to payments? And how do you do it in a manner that is pro-competition? If you try to pro-competition and then add the last dimension, which is to do so then in a manner that's also compliant. Many early adopters of cryptocurrencies and other digital assets have learned the hard way that there's often an incredibly wide entrance to get into the asset class, but when you're trying to get out, the exit is narrow and there's a crush of activity. The regulators have opinions, the law enforcement agencies have opinions, and many early adopters have learned the hard way that you can't reflect on those opinions after the fact once you're exposed to the asset. You have to do it at the front end. So part of what we're trying to design and part of what we're trying to do, and bear in mind it's only been a little over 6 months, is build something that would stand up as an institution. The analogy I would give you because of your dislike of the originator is the Linux Foundation for Payments, that for the association to work and to run open source, public, pro-competition ecosystems, it has to serve in a governance model that is long range and that is disinterested to the whims and will of any particular member of the association, and ultimately is building public infrastructure.
So, well, why don't we can you give us a roadmap? Like where and when can we expect to have something be launched? And
sure.
What are we looking at over the next year or 2 years?
Sure, and I do want to come back to the why. I think a lot has been said, and this is frankly one of my indictments of the technology space generally, but the blockchain world in particular, is that we spend a heck of a lot of time talking about the hardware and software, but we don't spend enough time talking about the outcomes. The why matters more than the how. So what does the roadmap look like? We clearly are 6 months into a project that began, like many blockchain projects, with a humble white paper. And in it outlines certain things that have to happen. Those things still matter, and they have to happen in sync. First, we have to get the association governance structure and independence and all the rest up and running at a level that would support a generational payment system that could support billions of people who are on the margins of today's payment networks. Job one. Job two, of the technology layer has to, of course, be up and running. You can't run a science experiment at this type of scale, so it has to work and it has to be robust and resilient. Job three is you have to overcome not entirely insurmountable hurdles that are both regulatory and political. And that, frankly, has been my chief role, and that's the job that I think has generated all the news that people have heard about the project. But that's an important job, because if we get it right, I think it's not only sort of an all ships rising moment for the space, it's an opportunity to create regulatory clarity and certainty for legitimizing digital assets, right? And so I think Libra invariably, because of the potential scale of the project, has been a force multiplier of changing the scope of the conversation.
So I too want to get into the why, because I think it's going to be a key part of this discussion, the one that we're having in a moment. But before I do, as a journalist, I still have to sort of push for a bit of news here. You just mentioned the regulatory framework, and that obviously is a critical part of what you're doing going forward, is getting at least sufficient level of support from the regulatory community and being compliant as best you can. But one of the things that seems to have been created a lot of pushback, is the concern that central banks will lose some control over monetary policy, and that seems to be revolving around the idea that you've got a basket of currencies rather than a one-on-one stablecoin model. And that therefore, yes, people will essentially be using this amalgam rather than the individual currencies. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, let's come back to that in a moment. But clearly, that's been a major part of the pushback narrative here. Is there any consideration to go back from the basket model to focus on the individual stable coins, for example? Where do things stand on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, so across the board for any type of project like this one that begins with an aspirational white paper and a set of aspirational goals, you then have to take on board the enormous amount of feedback we've received in the last 6 months. I mean, there's a reason we contributed very actively to the G7 working group on stablecoins. We've been an incredibly active contributor to that process along the way, and that's now being handed over to the G20. And we're getting important feedback. And one of the items that is a pretty consistent item of feedback is, how do central banks convey monetary policy in a world where there could be a wide-scale, ubiquitous digital payment network? And that requires perhaps some design trade-offs that we'll have to consider. We're still in the midst of those types of considerations. But there's no dogma here. There's no dogma about the design principle. There's no dogma about the basket construct. A lot of these things are designed to support an international use case that would be as low volatility as possible. Because if you think about the principal use case we've articulated, international remittances, the world's most important cash flow, greater than $700 billion a year, stubborn payment pricing at 7% globally, and the poorest people pay the most in that use case. So we've designed the basket concept to support that use case, but that doesn't necessarily preclude other alternative structures that might be simpler, more politically expedient. We're certainly open to those ideas.
Right. So yes, but let's talk about this, because this ultimately, from you on a personal level, has been the major motivator for this. Why don't you talk a little bit about what got you personally to this space? I met you. You came from an insurance background. You were doing sort of very innovative things in the insurance world, but you spent a lot of time focusing on the developing world, connections with Puerto Rico and the rest of the Caribbean, energy systems, those sorts of things, and sort of focused a lot on financial inclusion. So why was this idea, as opposed to, say, Bitcoin or Stellar or these other projects out there, the one that you felt was the only one that would arrive at this objective that you want to achieve in terms of financial inclusion?
Well, so poverty for me is not an abstraction, right? So when we articulate the goal of financial inclusion and improving basic financial access, the bottom rung of the ladder of economic mobility is payment access. If you can't get paid efficiently, regularly, and as close to free as possible, it's very hard to pull people up the economic ladder. And when you think about what that looks like, and make no mistake, this is not an emerging and developing country issue. It cost $30 to send $1,000 to Puerto Rico, where I'm from, if you want the $1,000 to arrive as close to overnight or as close to the next day as possible. And this is territorial United States. Both ends of the payment spectrum are KYC'd, and there's no good reason but for the fact that today's payment networks are like walled gardens. Yeah. Inside the walled garden of your payment institution or your banking institution, you have the option of very low-cost payments and low-friction payments. The second you go outside, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, friction is being introduced. And the analogy would be that it's a bit like the telephone networks 50 years ago, where you paid a higher fee based on the distance traveled over the fixed infrastructure. The same holds true in payments today and banking today. So imagine how valuable your email would be if you couldn't send from a Gmail account to a Hotmail or a Yahoo account and there was no interoperability. That problem means that we have 1.7 billion people with no bank account, 1.3 who are underbanked. And that friction is effectively pushing finance and payments to a point of no return. So short of big-scale digital transformation, for which that was the original promise of blockchain and these types of financial structures, how else do we extend the perimeter of finance?
You've basically laid out an argument for Bitcoin, for a decentralized solution, right? What you've done is to focus on a hybrid. This is a federated model. This is one that has governance of identified corporations in the middle of it. How does that get away from this problem of the gatekeepers and the walled gardens? How do you not yourselves become a walled garden?
Well, what it does is, I think it does a couple of things that are distinct, right? If you think about back to the international remittance corridors of the world, you have 230 million economic migrants all over the world. These are the people that power the GDP of their home countries. Peer-to-peer payments are bigger than foreign direct investment, bigger than official government aid and development assistance. And yet, there is no way for that to occur in near real time and near free. So, and then there's not a lot of competition. In remittance corridors, there's either one big monopolist player or there's a duopoly operator that controls those remittance corridors. And the people who could afford it the least pay the most. So I think if we do nothing else but introduce competition, introduce the opportunity for digital wallet providers to emerge that are interoperable, and there's a totally interoperable standard, that's a big game changer for the world. And to do that right, of course, means you have to go through the process we're going through now. Build a governance model that can withstand the vagaries and the vicissitudes of any one organization and the association, but also build a model that could achieve a regulatory standard that protects consumers, that recognizes that issues like privacy, that we don't live in a vacuum of policymakers, public interest, and regulation. We have to get these things right before it goes live.
And talk a little bit about that open platform model then, right? You're inviting wallet providers and other developers to build on top of this platform. Are you seeing much enthusiasm? Is there much traction on that? And again, how do you ensure that this truly is an open model and not one where essentially you're picking and choosing who gets to play?
Yeah, well, no, so since day one, and I think to this end, many, if not most, big open source projects invariably often have an originator. And so back to your question, you may not like the messenger, but you like the message. And I would say that since June 18th, when the white paper was issued and this was announced, the code base has been committed to an open source code model. And I think that alone, has seen quite a lot of developers. And I think, to me, there are two big social impacts of the Libra Association's vision. The first is to limit the excuses for financial exclusion. So it's no longer cost prohibitive to say, oh, I can't serve you or I can't get you paid at near low cost or free. The same thing that the internet has done for information sharing and communications is to remove those barriers and that friction. The second is, I think, to spur a wave of responsible financial services innovation, such that any developer anywhere in the world, to the extent they can code and leverage the open source code standards, can build supporting solutions. And that wave of innovation has to have a home. The home countries that allow for regulatory clarity of this innovation, and not just ours, but others, they stand to gain billions and billions of dollars of economic productivity if we get it right. So the stakes are pretty high.
Now, one of the things that got a lot of attention, of course, at the initial announcement was the presence of some big names in the association like MasterCard, Stripe, PayPal, and these guys left, right? We know the story. There was a lot of regulatory pushback. It was an uncomfortable time, and they just decided it wasn't right for them. It was seen at the time as that was giving more sort of diversity to this away from the dominance of Facebook. But it also, I think, meant that you combined the power of Facebook's 2.8 billion users with these very, very large, ubiquitous networks that Visa and MasterCard had and so forth. What happens now? I mean, and how important was the presence of those kind of networks in this? And do you need some other Rails system? What does the departure of those guys mean?
Yeah. So, needless to say, of course, this is part of the startup journey, right? That hindsight will look back and say, it's a startup journey. Companies will come and go, members will come and go. But if we get our governance right, we could withstand the shock of departures and additions. The other thing is, at some level, it is not necessarily new news because these are organizations like banks and other institutions that can build supporting solutions on an open standard. And so whether you're a part of the association or not, the ability to build a Libra supporting digital wallet and otherwise effectively becomes digital public commons or public good. And that's the model we're building for. The other sub-story to that is that, well, with the advent of these organizations leaving, the association lost its ability to deal with financial intelligence requirements or risk management requirements. And the truth is, the association has to stand up that expertise internally, irrespective of any individual member organization. The member organizations are there for really 3 reasons. The first is to run a node on the Libra blockchain and to be a validating engine. So we have the collective cybersecurity expertise of these types of large trusted enterprises. The second is to participate in the governance. 1 member, 1 vote, irrespective of size, irrespective of heft. And that process is alive and well. And you know, to argue for Facebook putting its type of influence in check, that's the best internal guardrail we have, is that no member can outvote the other, especially when you think about this eventually getting to 100 organizations. So you know, that common infrastructure then can be supported, whether you're a member of the association or not. You could build on top of that standard in a pretty open way.
And other organizations lining up? I mean, can we expect new names anytime soon?
Yeah, so you know, if my math serves, and I know you're a smart man, then you would envision that as a...
not so good though, but yes.
Well, that as a precondition of launch, we need to have 100 organizations a part of the association. 100 organizations would have 100 nodes on the Libra blockchain. Therefore, by you know, line of reasoning, we absolutely are continuing to grow the prospects of the association. We've had interest from, I think the last time I reported the number, more than 1,600 organizations around the world have expressed an interest. In there, you have banking institutions and many others for whom the infrastructure can help accelerate their own digital transformation journey.
Great. Well, why don't we open this up? So we're going to have Amy James from Alexandria Labs and Akin Sawyerr from Decred join us. But we do need another chair. So, great. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. But I think, you know, what I think is interesting about both of your presence here is, you know, we're looking at, one of the questions that's coming up is financial inclusion. And Akin, maybe you've got some things to say about that. And open systems. Mm-hmm. And Amy, this has been your life for the last 5 or 6 years. So that's where I want the conversation to go. But before that, Akin, why don't you introduce yourself, and Amy, pick up after that.
Yeah, so Akin Sawyerr, I lead up governance and strategy for Decred, which is a digital autonomous organization. And it's really built on this foundation that digital currencies are really the basis of new markets and new forms that are taking place. So beyond thinking about currencies and how currencies enable markets, at Decred, we have a very sophisticated governance process and system whereby the users and stakeholders actually inform the governance process, right? You have an ability to stake value and vote and actually determine the future pathway of the network. And in many ways, Decred is the antithesis of Libra, right? You know, when you think about Libra, it's sort of like, you know, in my view, like shipping the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? It's this idea that we have monetary systems that are run by governments, but now Libra is proposing monetary systems run by corporations. And I think that's actually a really bad idea. I think it's a bad idea because corporations over and over again have proven that in any situation where there's a principal agent, you know, problem, the agent will always do what's in their best interest, right? So Facebook does what's in its best interest with our private data to maximize its profits, right? The banks that almost blew up the financial system oftentimes, in fact, did things that were beneficial to the banks and detrimental to their customers. Right, so I think the fundamental idea around centralized authorities having power to determine money and to determine monetary policy is flawed. And what truly decentralized cryptocurrencies give you is a system where the network now becomes the way to enforce monetary policy. Right, so a Decred, similar to Bitcoin, there'll only be 21 million Decred ever mined. Right, so effectively it becomes a deflationary currency. Right, and if we design the system correctly, is this idea that as the network and marketplace grows, value will accrue to the currency. So anyone that holds the currency benefits in the upside, right, of the value as that economy grows. In centralized systems, the beneficiary is the corporation, right? The corporations will get together to figure out how to capture the majority of the benefit, capture most rents to the detriment of the users. So, we have a very, very different view, and we think that, true decentralized currencies actually are the way to go in that they empower individual sovereignty. They're permissionless, so anyone can participate and adhere to the rules. They're censorship resistant, which is really important. It's this idea that my value and my wealth is controlled by me, and no third party can either tell me or censor me or exclude me from the financial system. And so I think those things are really important.
So I want to come back to all of that and get Dante to respond, but Amy, let's have you give the story about Alexandria and OIP.
Absolutely. This is going to be a really exciting conversation because I'm kind of like the bridge between their two points of view. So hi, everyone. My name is Amy James. I am the co-inventor of Open Index Protocol. I feel like my mic is a little hot. And that is an index for the web, right? Think of the web like a giant library. It's kind of what it is, giant place of information. But there is no card catalog right now. Well, there are some, but they're owned by those corporations, right? Google has an index, and does Bing even license Google's index now, right? Like all of the indexes are owned by these private corporations. So what Open Index Protocol is a specification that's really a complement to HTTP that makes an open source, open specification for any kind of content distribution. And inside that record, you can also put information about the content, like my name, the title, the publishing date, the description, any kind of tagging information, of course. But you can also put the commercial information. So if I want to sell something or license something or have terms of use about something, I can attach that to that piece of information as well. It's currently in use right now by the Teton County in the state of Wyoming for their property records. That was a pilot program that we did with Overstock subsidiary Medici Land Governance. Caltech has built a couple of applications on it. We're working with Streambed Media now. There's a bunch of projects that are built on Open Index Protocol. I won't be able to get into all of them. I am also the CEO of Alexandria Labs, and that is a company that is supporting Open Index Protocol, primarily through tools, but also through an application where you can search all the records. It's sort of like I hate to use this reference because it's Google, but the Google of Open Index Protocol, right? Where you can find everything. When you look at Caltech's app, all you're looking at is Caltech's records. But when you look at Alexandria, you can see Caltech's records and the state of Wyoming's records and Streambed's records and all of the records. I am also now, launching today, the creator of the What Kind of Internet Do You Want series. Our hashtag is Make the Internet Free Again. But I feel like I need to work on that a little bit because I don't mean free as in no cost. I mean free as in freedom, where we have an open space, kind of like we do in real life. There's really no public space on the internet today. And so what we're doing with the What Kind of Internet Do You Want series is cracking open this conversation and talking about these issues that we're wrestling with here on the stage today. So you can find us on YouTube right now and Alexandria coming soon.
So why don't we pick up on that concept of freedom, right? Because I think both Akin and Amy, you've mentioned it, and the principle that's being discussed here, at least from these perspectives, Dante, is that only a true decentralized system, one that doesn't have a Google in the middle or a Facebook or a big bank, can in fact create the environment in which people can exchange value in a peer-to-peer free basis. But you looked heavily. I mean, you were involved. You and I spent a lot of time talking about Bitcoin and its opportunities. You eventually decided that this was the only way forward. How do you address the comments from Akin in particular, and square that back to why we do or don't have these governance risks that he's alluding to?
Sure. Well, and of course it's not one or the other, right? I mean, the world is not zero sum, and I don't think it's black and white either. I think the Bitcoin as an asset class has proven that mathematically driven digital scarcity can produce an incredibly compelling, incredibly empowering asset. It's an important asset, but it's not a means of payment supporting billions of people who are unbanked or underbanked. It just isn't. And you have Bitcoin Pizza Day as just a stark reminder of the hypervolatility and the buyer's remorse and the spender's remorse when that asset is exchanged as a means of payment. So in that vein, I think the application of crypto purity test to a project that is trying to solve a social problem that no other crypto project has solved for yet, I think is a little bit maybe unfair or a little heavy-handed. I mean, and the job to be proven is to trust new institutions. You have to judge them over time, and you have to judge them based on results.
Yes.
And that's why I joined. I joined the Libra Association because it's fundamentally stood up as an independent entity. Irrespective of the sins of the father, don't visit them on the son. And our job is to try to build something that could be a lasting, meaningful, independent institution. If we can't prove that, not only will I lose Akin's trust, but I'll lose the market's trust and we'll lose the regulator's trust.
That's absolutely right. Can I hop in?
Sure.
Okay. So basically what you're saying is that incentives influence outcomes, right? If you perform well and you earn that trust over time, you should be rewarded for it. And right now, we are only trusting the services that are provided to us because they're our only option. And we see this gorgeous future, this decentralized future where everything is completely independent, censorship resistant. We are running our own nodes in this fully peer-to-peer way. We are even on a mesh net. There's no more Wi-Fi anymore, right? It's like that great. Okay, how do we get from here to there? There's a missing piece that is just sort of not talked about yet in this conversation. Yep. So there's a fantastic article that has been a buzz in the Twitterverse lately called Protocols Not Platforms. Did I get that right?
Think
Protocols Not Platforms. Yeah.
I think it is.
Yeah. And he talks about this exact conversation that we're in right now. But the implied assumption, and the implied assumption or the unspoken assumption in what you said as well about people holding the tokens and the value goes up over time, that's an important aspect of the economic model that we're looking at, but it's not the whole picture. There's this missing piece, how we get from here to there. And I believe that that missing piece are the layer 2 protocols, like Open Index Protocol, like Lightning Network, that have a mechanism by their very nature that they interface with base layer protocols. We'll call those fat protocols, like Joel Menegra's landmark article about this value flow model, right? Fat protocols are the blockchains, they're the tokens, they're where all of the value that we've learned about so far on this crypto journey has lived. And then in our current model, all of the values at the application layer. In Joel's piece, he called that thin protocols because those are just running on, TCP/IP, HTTP, and then the entire application layer is closed, and that's where the value is captured. What layer 2 protocols are going to do in this next era of the future is they are going to create incentive at the application layer for competition between applications. So that's exactly why projects like Libra are so important because, how many people are on Facebook? All of those people having easy access into crypto is amazing. It is game-changing, and it really shows all of us the tremendous opportunity before us and how quickly things could change. And we need projects like that to interface with the regulators, to go to all of that work. But then how do they then recapture that value from those base layer protocols that are basically all the same? Those are going to shrink down to a commodity, basically, in how they're traded, right, once we're at scale. And so the solution to that is this competitive incentive at the application layer through the layer 2 protocols directing some value there automatically.
Yeah, so I mean, just to jump in, I think competition is good, and I don't want people to think that I don't think Libra should exist. But I think over time.
Well, Facebook, of course. That's right.
Sure. But I think over time it will be proven that fundamentally you cannot escape this idea that centralized systems are prone to capture, right? There's a reason why even in the U.S. as a country we elect public officials, but then over time, they now start serving their interests and the interests of the few, right? It's prone to capture. The banking system is prone to capture, right? That's an economic fact, and we've seen that happen over and over again, right? And I think that Libra will be no different because fundamentally you have a big dichotomy between the goals and the values of the Libra Council and what they want long term and what's good for the individual. And at some point, there will be a clash of those two incentives, and more likely than not, the council will do what's in its best interest. Right? We haven't even talked about things like the underlying data, right? We haven't talked about how Libra will extend surveillance capitalism, for example, where you now have KYC systems where people in emerging markets can now be tracked by their transactions, and that data becomes extremely valuable. Now, will the Libra Council make that freely open to everyone, or will they co-opt that data and information like they've proven over time too, and monetize that? Right? Those are fundamental questions, and I think the other side of it too is, I think the goal of the Libra Council around financial inclusion, around remittances, I don't actually think that's feasible. I don't think it's feasible because if Libra is successful, for example, in a country like Zimbabwe or Nigeria in Africa that have fairly high inflation, as a utility, a lot of people would adopt it if it's more stable and a more stable store of value. But that fundamentally erodes the ability for central banks in those countries to control monetary policy. So no self-respecting central bank in the emerging world would allow Libra to basically co-opt its monetary policy, right? And I don't think there's any way that those goals will be reached without some sort of KYC, extending the reach of US dominance and power. So I think fundamentally those goals are not actually attainable by the Libra Council.
Right, so I want Dante to respond to that, but before I do, let's just frame this discussion a bit here, right? Because I think that we're still at this open question moment because what we're talking about are some fundamental concerns, right? Governance is one, right? So the idea that making sure that bad actors are kept off the system, making sure that there's no sort of collectives that emerge to exploit the system to the detriment of the users. That can either be run through a system with an open association, bunch of rules, going through a legal framework that is clearly the structure around which the association works, or we can have a decentralized staking model, right? The thing about the latter, is that as wonderful as utopian as it sounds, we still haven't yet been able to figure out how to make this thing work
I don't think that's
in
true.
An efficient way, right?
So we're doing that at Decred, right?
Okay.
So Decred has a decentralized governance system where every participant can opt into the governance framework. So I, as a holder of a token, can stake my token, and that gives me, one, a right to secure the network, but also gives me the ability to actually have a say in the governance process.
And how do you deal with scaling, right? It may be that it's a layer 2 solution, but right, this to me, all of these models are beautiful in their design,
right.
But there's this sort of practicality
Exactly.
problem with scale, which is, again, one of the reasons why Libra suddenly comes along and says, we can deliver scale, right? Can you scale that, and how do you scale that?
So, at Decred, we've had an off-chain governance system that's been live for over a year. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of users on the network who actually put proposals through the system, determine the future development of the platform, have individual sovereignty, right? There's no one who is going to have a greater deal of, I think in human behavior, right, you are the best person to secure your self-interest. And when you delegate that power to someone else, you open up yourself to lots of risks and moral hazard.
Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. Sorry. I have to say this.
Sure.
I can talk a good tech game now. I've been in tech for almost 6 years. But my background is in the arts. And this is precisely the issue that we're talking about. Because even though I know a lot about tech, I really don't like going into all of my little settings and adjusting all that stuff and like finding that thing and oh my gosh, they updated something and now I have to look at it again. I would much rather proxy that to someone I trust. My favorite analogy for this is cutting my hair, because I could cut my own hair, like it's possible. But I prefer to outsource that service to somebody who I trust. Right?
You guys, what do you do about your hair, by the way?
Yeah, right.
Sorry, let's just segue.
Right.
Carry on, Amy,
And
sorry.
that is precisely what we're talking about, because protocols like Decred are super important. Those base layer protocols that are all going to be interoperable kind of components or puzzle pieces that various applications plug together to serve those end users. But those end users need some sort of, those applications need some sort of incentive to do all that work. It's a ton of work to run an application. It's a ton of work to meet and serve end users. And they need a reason to do that work. And right now, what we're seeing when we're working in an environment based on the argument that you're making about, well, everyone should just be completely independent, the network should be fully decentralized, is that we're seeing the same architects, the same builders who built the protocol, build an application for it. So there's one application, and it's sometimes fine.
So that's not true,
but
right?
Well,
you know,
can I want to just, so we're talking about whether or not human beings will willingly participate, right? This is it. Like, and interestingly, we have countries in which just, like Switzerland, where you happen to have your association based, actually a participatory democracy. It's remarkable how much the Swiss actually get involved in these questions of day-to-day governance. Now, whether or not it's something that you would worry about at a technical level, on these technical questions is a different issue. But it does seem to me as if we don't know, right? Some societies opt out, some community, well, let's use the word community. Some communities opt out, some do. I want you to wait.
If I could just, add a point, I think many of the utopians and many of the early believers who didn't believe in gravity learned the hard way through the ICO bubble and through the depths of crypto winter that when you could be served suit and there's a physical human being and a physical address, you can't absolve yourself of liability and accountability. Think of the Quadriga CX debacle in Canada. 100,000 Canadians were exposed to losses, $140 million worth of digital assets because one person lost the keys to the city, right? $722 million crypto pyramid scheme is just unraveled. So I think we have to accept that for this asset class to really transform finance and to successfully overcome enormous political and regulatory hurdles, it has to have a body around it that takes accountability and that says, at the end of the day, you cannot, escape from, if you're offering consumer services and products and financial services, you have to be able to perform according to a certain expectation. That's the public interest that is pushing back against crypto super, super, super hard. And we have to come back to that, not with, I'm going to totally be radical and amorphous and intangible and everybody's empowered. That's a great ideal. But that's not an end state we will ever achieve, and let alone scale to a level where we can incorporate more of humanity in the very bloody basics of finance, unless we accept some obligations. And that's the kind of dynamic I think
the
you
obligations
see on the stage.
you can, right, and the reality of the crypto bubble bursting was that the powers of a government, essentially, were far bigger than had been supposed, and that ultimately you have to answer to that legal framework, right? Were those token securities? Well, it was always going to be a legal question. Pretty much the answer is yes, right?
But yes and no, because to say that the bubble burst simply because governments push back would also negate the effect of greed and all of the other bad aspects of human conduct that would be true in any economy.
But there was an internet bubble and it burst, but from that emerged Amazon and trillion-dollar companies, right? So I think in every new system there's always going to be nefarious actors, but that's not the narrative, right? I think fundamentally what I'm talking about is that the rules of the game have to be fair and transparent, and the governance framework has to ensure that special interests do not take over these networks. And I believe that the only way to really get there is to empower the individual to have some level of base level sovereignty. Now, I think that once you have an economic system where the rules are clear, the rules can be gamed, and they cannot be changed by third parties who want to co-opt it, then other things get built on top of that, right? And so to the point you made about second layer implementations, we have second layer implementations already being built in Decred with Lightning Network, and we think that once you build all those pieces that ensure that the base layer rules are well governed and they're clear and they're trustworthy, then new layers will come and build on top of it. But it has to be in a permissionless and decentralized way, where people are free to leverage the open source software, build iterations of it. They can build centralized systems and applications on top of it if they want, but the core rules have to be designed such that they're not co-opted. And my fundamental position is that anytime you have centralized authorities with the keys and with the ability to determine winners and losers, ultimately they'll make themselves the winners. And I think time and time in history we've seen that occur over and over again. And I'm not convinced that a council of self-interested companies can do money better than a decentralized system. I'm not convinced.
I just want to pick up on the role of government, though, right? And it's, again, whether it's the SEC's take on tokens, and whether you're right, there is obviously the greed factor that was a reality there. But the problem that so many implementers of crypto solutions have faced is they run up against these regulatory realities. And yet, it seems to me, looking at the Libra debate and the congressional hearings, our policymakers just do not understand what's going on here. And the way that gets me most riled up is this contradiction, this dichotomy between, on the one hand, wagging the finger at Facebook because they shouldn't be abusing their users' data and shouldn't be tracking individuals, and they shouldn't have all this information on them, and therefore we're going to stand up for the little guy and protect you against this horrible institution. And then saying to Facebook, oh, but by the way, you need to comply with every KYC, right. AML rule we have. You need to make sure that you get all the identities of all those users and da-da-da-da to us. And they're just speaking out of both sides of their mouth and not realizing that that's an inherent contradiction, right? So it seems to me that we, as a society, have to confront that duality and figure out what we want. And get all of our policymakers to get that we just can't necessarily have our cake and eat it too. Maybe there's a solution. Maybe it's zero knowledge proofs. Maybe it's something like this, right? But the bottom line is, our regulatory framework doesn't serve the needs of the digital economy in which we live, right? So I just want you guys to pick up on that. Maybe, Amy, you could weigh, because I mean, you've been thinking a lot about that framework. How do you think about where OIP exists within the world of law, right?
So I think that if I had one message to pass along to regulators, it would be that there are technical solutions to a lot of the problems that they're struggling with right now. And it would behoove everyone to look at the technical solutions rather than trying to write a whole bunch of laws. Because if they try to write a whole bunch of laws, startups like mine aren't going to be able to comply with those laws necessarily. And so what will happen to us trying to figure this whole puzzle out? It will become very, very difficult. But there are real and serious problems that they're confronting. The thing is that in real life, most of those real and serious problems already have laws that apply to them. And so what we actually need is to just prosecute the people that are already breaking those laws.
Right. I think fundamentally the regulatory system is designed for a past world. Right? The regulatory system is designed where you have firms as intermediaries, right? People organize in firms because there are all sorts of efficiencies, right? The reasons why firms exist is to cater to market inefficiencies, right? The reason why people might work for a company is that it costs too much money looking for the next project over and over again. So maybe having a job and some stability makes sense. But the regulatory system was designed to police all these third parties, right, to, as much as possible, try to ensure that they do not act in a natural way to co-opt the system. To some extent, the regulatory system has been successful, and to a large extent, as we've shifted to a more technology-driven world, they have failed to keep up because they can't. Now, the future is in decentralized protocols where the regulators can actually see that the game is fair, right? The monetary policy of a cryptocurrency can be gamed, it can be audited, the game is fair. Right, so in some ways,
I like to say, it's kind of like a honeypot. Like, please break the law on OIP, then we'll have a time-stamped record of who did it and when. It's kind of ridiculous.
Guys, we are down to 30 seconds. I just want Dante to close this out, if you don't mind, because you have been in the trenches, basically, grappling with regulators, talking to these guys. Can you give me a quick summation of where you think this all goes?
Yes, well, I think we'll get there. I think the gap is closing in terms of what is required from public policy and regulators. And you're now hearing more and more, I think, an actual commitment to regulate the activity, not the technology, and regulate the economic behavior of the digital asset. Don't create a catch-all that just pushes this genie back in the bottle. So I think there's an acceptance that we can get it right.
Great. All right. On that note, folks, it's a round of applause for this fabulous panel.